Welcome, I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate. You know him, you love him, you read him in the National Review and see him on TV way too often. Good friend John Fund, good to see you.
Pleasure, thanks John.
All right, and I've told you this before. You and perhaps Michael Barone know more about what goes on in politics outside of Washington, D.C. than anybody I know. I mean, you pick up tidbits from where politics really happens out in the States. You know more about Colorado politics than most Coloradans.
Not so much that Michael Barone or I got Donald Trump's election right. I said he had a 35% chance of winning. The good news is everyone else said he had 5. So
not bad.
To be wrong, but not completely wrong.
But it is a really interesting niche that you have. That, I mean, you do national correspondence. You always have, whether it was with a journal,
the
or
Washington
Fox.
stuff. Sure.
Yeah. But the granular stuff that it bubbles up, that's kind of a beat almost onto your own.
But look how much state issues, local issues, eventually affect national politics. We saw that with the Trump phenomenon. It was the fact that these states, the blue wall states that Hillary Clinton was counting on, that had gone Democratic for 30 years, clearly there was a voters' revolt there. We'd seen some early signs of it, the passage of right to work in Michigan, the Wisconsin labor reforms. There was real turmoil in Iowa. We saw in Ohio lots of changes. So these states were moving in a more conservative populist direction before Trump. Trump accelerated that change, and on election day, that made a big difference. When Trump carried Iowa and Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio, several of those for the first time in 30 years for Republicans, that made the election.
All right. I was late to the Trump train. All right.
I may be still on the platform.
But at the end of the day, I couldn't take her. Just couldn't do it. And my love for Antonin Scalia grabbed my vote. And so far, I've been remarkably impressed. Maybe my expectations were like, I don't know what's going to happen here. Give me, everyone's doing the first 100 days. Are you impressed? Are you surprised? Are you disappointed? Give me the quick thumbnail view, and then we'll dive into it.
The Supreme Court pick for conservatives was a home run. Neil Gorsuch is not only an admirable man and a careful judicial scholar, but he's shown a great deal of intelligence and wisdom on the bench in the 10th Circuit, which is headquartered here in Denver. The rest of the administration is a work in progress. I think the president has done a very good job on executive orders. He's done everything from some labor law reform to some rollbacks on environmental issues. He's finally permitted the Dakota Access and the Keystone Pipeline. There's been a freeze on certain, I think, very anti-consumer measures coming out of the federal regulatory bureaucracy. And there's also been, I think, a rollback on certain foreign policy initiatives, which I think were very dangerous to this country. The drift that we were seeing in foreign policy for the last 8 years. So on executive orders, I think the president has done a good job. When it comes to building a team, I think he's done a bad job. What's the percentage?
Team inside the White House or a team
with
the Congress?
A president has about 550 appointments that require Senate confirmation. He has about 4,000 or 5,000 more that don't require Senate confirmation. People he can name to the government, where he can stamp his imprint on the government. Well, what percentage of that 550 Senate confirmable appointments do you think he's made?
I have no idea, but I bet you do.
5%.
So 100 days in, we're 5% in the way of filling.
He's way behind for other presidents. Now, part of that is he's new to the job. This is the first president we've ever had who's never served in elective office or been a senior figure in the military. So that's some of the explanation. But the personnel office, which helps run these things through the White House, is doing a bad job. At this point in Bill Clinton's administration in 1993, he had 100 people working in his personnel office. Donald Trump has 17. I believe you can make the government work with fewer people, but you cannot have a revolution without revolutionaries. If you're going to dismantle parts of the government and change the course of other parts of the government, you're going to need people to do it, and you're going to need your people to do it. So on that, I give him a bad mark. On relations with Congress, which is also part of building a team in a different way, He's doing well. He did a lot more consulting with Congress.
Let me push on that one. In that I thought the decision to go after Obamacare first was a strategic blunder. In that, going in, he should have gone after taxes, particularly corporate taxes, first and hard, because I think it was an easier, more understandable, less complicated subject, which you'd get some Democratic buy-off on as well. And to start off with the Obamacare debacle, and it was a debacle.
You asked me how Trump was doing.
Yeah.
That decision was a Republican Congress decision.
Fair enough.
I think Trump went along with it to his discredit, but I think that was a Republican Congress decision. And the reason was they were under enormous amount of pressure to deliver on the signature promise that they had made, which was to repeal and replace Obamacare. Plus, they needed the money, the tax money that was going to be wiped out from Obamacare. They needed that in order to help push tax reform, because they wanted to see what taxes were already gone before they went to tax reform. In the end, I think Trump learned from that to this extent. I think he's consulted far more with Congress on the tax proposal that's just come out, especially giving them a lot of say in the details, because it's only going to pass Congress if they have their own imprint on it. They've come back now, and they now have a second health care bill. The first one was botched.
Well,
and
on
apparently
the
the Freedom Caucus has come on board.
Did you support the
No,
Freedom Caucus?
I thought they could have done a better job, and I think that both the Freedom Caucus and the moderates had problems with it. Now the Freedom Caucus is on board. They're trying to get the moderates on board.
I guess what I'm asking was the original proposal, what some labeled Obamacare Light. I did not like it. I didn't.
Well, John, look, I believe that there is no fundamental right for an American to automatically have health care on the taxpayer's dime. I do believe we have a moral obligation to help those in trouble. I do believe there have to be provisions for people with high-risk diseases, pre-existing conditions, and other things. But I do not believe that providing health care, cradle to grave, is a fundamental responsibility of the federal government.
I thought if Republicans passed it, they would now own a broken product.
Here's the problem. When Trump campaigned, and when almost every one of these Republican congressmen campaigned, did you hear any of them say, you know, I want to get rid of that ban on pre-existing conditions. I want to get rid of that, inability to discriminate on the inability to discriminate on the basis of age when you're giving out health benefits. Right. I want to get rid of that provision that allows kids up to age 26 to stay on their parents' policy. Did you hear anyone campaigning on those things? No. So what they didn't tell people was, we want to repeal as much of Obamacare that isn't supported by 70% of the American people as we can, and then we replace as much as we can, get away with.
Will this new Freedom Caucus okay to plan? Will it make it through and win?
I think it will make through the House very narrowly. The Senate is going to be more difficult, because they're going to have to make decisions about how much they push through the Senate under reconciliation, which is an arcane budget process by which you need only 50 votes plus the vice president to pass something, rather than the 60 votes, which is normally the threshold for a filibuster. In theory, you can only pass things with a majority vote in the Senate if it's budget related. Well, what's budget related? There's some precedent as to whether or not the Obamacare rescissions and replacement would be included or not. It's up to the Senate parliamentarian. The Senate parliamentarian works for the Republicans, but has an independent judgment. I think they're going to have a very broad definition, because the Democrats are going to play monkey wrench law. They're going to literally give them almost no votes to replace Obamacare. I don't know how much they can get through the Senate, but whatever they get through the Senate, Trump will sign. And I think that in the end, he'll be able to say, I fulfilled most of my promise.
Taxes. I look at what the outline, and I'm thinking, so far,
that's all we have is an outline.
Is the outline. I love the outline. This reminds me very much of the Reagan tax cuts, which gave us a period of growth. And for me, the issue is economic growth. The stagnation we've had for the last decade.
The lowest growth rates of any recovery from a recession in history.
We're in trouble if we can't get back to 3 and 4% economic growth.
Liberals say the days when we can have 3%, 4% economic growth are gone. They say the aging baby boomers and other changes in the economy mean we're going to have to get used to the new normal, which is 2%. Well, I don't believe that. I think the historical average for growth in this country is 3.6% a year. That's often come at times when we've had enormous economic dislocations, including, absorbing waves of immigrants. I think we can do better than 2%. Frankly, we're going to have to, because if we don't, the cuts that are going to be made in entitlement programs to your children, your grandchildren, their children are going to be brutal. The only way we pay for our government is to have economic growth. Even there, we're going to have dramatic entitlement reform because we're running out of money. So I think, yes, I'm worried about the deficit, but remember, Obama ran up the deficit from 10 trillion to 20 trillion, the national debt, in 8 years. Trump will add to that. The question is, what did we get for the 10 trillion Obama put us in hock to? I don't see a whole lot. Remember, we were supposed to have an infrastructure program. It was called stimulus. I think the roads and the bridges and everything else are still falling down. I think that was unfinished business from the Obama years. If Trump's tax plan passed, the historical experience from John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, to Ronald Reagan, a Republican, to George W. Bush and capital gains tax cuts, to even Jimmy Carter, who cut the capital gains tax, is a large chunk of those tax cuts, if they're in the right areas that promote investment and economic injection of innovation, that can pay for 30 or 40% of what the tax cut doesn't bring in.
The Republicans pulled together on this one. This has to be the one they act like a real team.
They have no choice. What did Ben Franklin said? We either hang together or we hang separately.
Talk to me a little bit about Korea. I keep hearing all the fear, there's going to be a war, there's going to be a war, there's going to be a war.
There's not going to be a war.
How do you know? The man's
There's not
itching.
gonna
I
be a
keep
war.
hearing he wants to do
Which
this.
one, the man in Korea or the man in Washington?
Why? Will there be military action?
No.
Why not?
I don't think anyone ultimately wants it. There could be a miscalculation. That's how we got World War I. Various miscalculations in the parts of the players. We obviously have to be concerned about that. There's three parts to this. There's Korea, there's China, and there's the U.S. The U.S. is extremely worried about Korean missiles that will be able to hit the U.S., starting with Hawaii and then, of course, the mainland. Obviously, we have a problem with Korea's bellicose behavior. The Chinese provide 90% of the raw materials that the Koreans import. They take in 90% of the exports of North Korea. They don't particularly like the regime, but they do not want North Korea to collapse and reunify with the South. That would bring a pro-Western government with a large military right on their border. So that's why the Chinese have moved 300,000 of their best troops to the North Korean border. It's a symbol to the U.S. Whatever happens, we're not giving North Korea up. So the question becomes, what can we do to press the Chinese to prod the North Koreans into changing without getting the Chinese to think that their prodding is going to cause a collapse of the regime, folding them into the arms of South Korea? What the Chinese might be willing to do is have a Finlandized, neutral, non-military North Korea, disarmed North Korea if the government collapses. That's very hard to stage, manage, or plan in advance. These are very complicated things. I'll tell you what I think we're going to do ultimately. 15 years ago, George W. Bush, for about 2 years, really put pressure on the North Koreans, because the North Korean regime is not really a government, it's a mafia. They make their money through prostitution overseas, they make their money through counterfeiting American currency, they make their money through illicit banking activity, they sell drugs, they sell arms around the world, they sell nuclear weaponry around the world. So they're basically a criminal gang trying to bring in enough foreign currency to keep the whole show going in Pyongyang. We cut back on their ability to use Chinese banks, to use banks in Macau and Hong Kong. We trapped many of their diplomats in money laundering schemes and shut them down. We prevailed upon governments from Thailand to Malaysia to crack down on the North Korean embassies that were doing illicit business out of the embassies. And the North Koreans were screaming. They were screaming because they were losing real money. And there was danger that they weren't able to get getting the foreign exchange that they needed to keep their regime going. Then Condoleezza Rice changed everything and said, oh, now it's time to negotiate. Now that we've gotten their attention, now it's time to negotiate. That was 10 years ago. The negotiations have been a complete failure. You can't trust a criminal gang. It's like going to The Godfather and expecting The Godfather to be a statesman. It doesn't happen.
The amount of fear-mongering that's going on over this is bizarre. You know, listen, when Obama won, I was depressed, all right? But I swear to God, I didn't cry. I didn't.
You didn't move to Canada.
I didn't move to Canada. I didn't freak out. I've heard the stories firsthand of teachers crying, people I know who cried for weeks. The world is ending. How could this happen? And now, 100 days later, this is the new normal. The sun is coming up. The bureaucracy still moves. What's been the biggest surprise for you in these under the new regime?
The biggest surprise is not what Donald Trump is all about. I've known him for 28 years, and he is crass, and he is crude, and he's very calculating.
When you say you know him, I know you've had dinner with him, you've spent some time with him. I mean,
well, I've had interactions with him for 28 years. We're not friends, I can assure you, even less after some of my columns. But I think he respects me, and I respect him. He is the best way to understand Donald Trump is I went back and I read the autobiography of P.T. Barnum, who was the great circus showman and impresario of the 1850s to the 1890s. Donald Trump is the P.T. Barnum of today. A master showman, a master salesman, a master marketer, a master brander. And it turns out that Barnum was sheer genius in what he was able to constantly bring new acts, constantly attract people's attention, constantly, you know, the hand is quicker than the eye. He would constantly move and distract your attention over here when what he's really doing is over here. And he was a genius in those respects. And in fact, the irony is, guess how P.T. Barnum ended his career? He went into politics. He was the elected mayor of New Haven, the mayor who brought the first streetcar line in the Northeast into operation. And he was getting ready to run for governor of Connecticut when he died suddenly. So I think Donald Trump is following in P.T. Barnum's footsteps, and he has the same strengths and some of the same weaknesses.
Let's talk about the strengths first, because the most enjoyable part of this has been watching the media reaction.
That's the thing that surprised me the most, by the way.
What?
The complete unhinging of the American left. By the way, they're sincere. I thought they were play acting during the campaign. You know, Trump is a monster, Trump is a fascist. No, they're not play acting.
No,
they're
not. And it's been the most enjoyable thing in the world to watch. This is worth the price of admission alone. I listen to NPR all the time, and to see in the last year, the screed they have been on, but trying to do that in that very self-important, monotone way that they do it, it's been enjoyable. But they're losing their stuff. And it seems to me that the stuff that used to count, the scandals that would take down anybody, falls away from this guy. As if when the media tells us, do you realize he did this, but he said that? And we go, yeah.
Well, the people out in the country have believed that most politicians do that most of the time, so Trump isn't that unusual from their point of view. He fits into the normal parameters of political behavior. Here's what I've noticed about the media. They forget two things when it comes to Donald Trump. Two things. One, Trump has low approval ratings for a president at this point in his presidency. He's a very polarizing figure. There's about 45% of the country. I mean, he could walk on water, and of course they'd sneer. The media's approval rating, who do you trust more, Trump or the media? Trump is about a 10-point lead. So they're criticizing from a position of weakness. When Trump says fake news, that resonates with an awful lot of people. Not that the news is made up, but is the news biased? Is it tilted? Are some subjects covered more than others? You betcha. It certainly is. The second thing, they got the 2016 election wrong. You know, I got it mostly wrong, but they got it completely wrong. They missed it in a big way. They did not serve their readers well. They did not explain the phenomenon that was happening between the coasts, and they lost it. We now have a new study from Politico magazine, which looked at labor department statistics, where people work, what fields they work in, where they live. John, 90% of people who work in internet publishing live in counties that Hillary Clinton carried. 75%, if you add in newspapers, which are more geographically dispersed than in the internet, in terms of employees. 75% of newspaper and internet employees work in counties that Hillary Clinton carried. The media bubble isn't only real, it's all-encompassing.
And they don't see it. And I've got a lot of friends who are reporters, and I'll say, who in your newsroom voted for Trump? None of them.
Well,
None
even if some did, or one did, they would never admit it.
No, in these instances, I believe them.
Yeah.
Because none of them did.
Well, look in Colorado.
But they don't see, they don't feel the bubble that they're in.
Well, look in Colorado. Denver, 75% Clinton. Boulder, 70% Clinton. That's where they live. They did not pick up the places where Trump and Romney did about the same in Colorado. They lost the state by about 4 or 5 points. Trump carried Pueblo, Colorado. The first time a Republican has done that since the 1950s. Trump carried parts around Durango that no Republican had carried since the 1950s. Trump had a different constituency. He lost to Republicans who were well educated in some areas, Douglas County, Arapahoe, but he gained in a lot of other counties, especially places where people felt the federal government was destroying their ability to earn a living from resource management. John, I think that they have to understand that even though they don't agree with Trump, they have to understand the Trump phenomenon. And I think they're only doing that grudgingly and haltingly at best.
Explain then the Trump phenomenon. And you're probably better at this than most people I know because you're not caught up in the emotion of it on either side. From looking at it, how do you explain this Trump phenomenon and how far does it go?
There's a new book that's coming out. In fact, you should have the author on your show. It's called Ronald Reagan, Blue Collar Republican. It's by Henry Olson from the Ethics and Public Policy Center. It's a brilliant book. It goes back and it reminds us that while Reagan was a conservative, he always talked about the forgotten man. He referenced FDR's concern for the need to give people a helping hand. He didn't embrace all the New Deal did, but he recognized the New Deal said we're all in this together. We're all citizens, and citizenship matters, and for all Americans, we should all care to some extent about each other. Well, globalization, the segmentation of people into areas where they live with the people that they're most alike, and they have no contact with the people who are different from them. We've had 70 years of that, so we ended up with people on the West Coast and the East Coast, frankly, just sneering at flyover country. And I have to say, Ronald Reagan spoke to those people and said, I want a rising tide to lift all boats, and that includes you in the middle of the country. And Donald Trump said the same thing. He said to the forgotten steelworker, I don't agree with all of his prescriptions, but he said, the trading deals took away your job. The federal government has taken away your livelihood through environmental regulations. He identified an adversary, he identified a cause of their economic discontent, and he spoke directly to it. Regardless of party, they rallied to it.
I'm starting to see, which I haven't seen in over a decade in this state, fractures on the left. And I'm talking mostly in potential primaries. Here in Colorado, the left has always been pretty solid. Even if they do have a contested primary, somehow they don't kill each other during those primaries. Republicans, we seem to savage each other so that the ultimate winner can't win it.
The Democratic Party is more of a hive. The Republican Party is quarreling individualists.
Exactly. But that hive is starting to fracture. We could have a very, very tight Democratic primary for the first time in 12 years on the Democratic side. And for the lack of a better term, the Bernieites and the Clintonites are starting to peel apart. And this hard-edged progressivism is now front and center in the Democratic Party. Democrats in Colorado, you know this, from Roy Romer and on, yeah, they were Democrats, but they weren't hard-edged social engineer progressives.
When a party loses, it has to make a choice. Was it partly our fault, or was it the fault that we weren't pure enough? Well, the decision the Democratic Party has made since Hillary's loss is we weren't pure enough. Give you an example. The Democrats took back the House in 2006 under Rahm Emanuel because he picked people in Republican districts he was going after who fit the district. The county sheriff who was pro-gun and maybe made pro-life noises and who didn't want to give away the store on spending. And they won back the House in 2006 with that, and Bush's unpopularity. Well, now, of course, they're trying to come back again. In these special elections, Georgia, Montana, South Carolina, the one in Florida, who are they nominating? All of those places, the Democratic candidate is a Bernie Sanders supporter. A Bernie Sanders supporter. In Kansas, a district Trump won by 27 points. A trial lawyer who had backed Bernie Sanders had been his chairman. Even though Trump is unpopular in some of those areas with some independent voters, you do not make your way back to a majority with Bernie Sanders people.
Less than a minute here. What do you expect in 2018? That either this is going to go one of two ways. Traditionally, if history is a guide, it is going to be a terrible year for Republicans, both on the local and national level, because that's what happens. But we're in uncharted territory here.
Also, the Senate seats are so skewed. There's so many more Democratic seats. It's hard for the Republicans to lose the Senate even in that year. John, very quickly, it depends if Trump delivers on his promises. Does he pass a health care bill that's viewed as making things better? Does he pass a tax reform that's viewed as making things better? If he succeeds in implementing his vision into laws, the Republicans will do fine. If he doesn't, it'll be, gosh, they couldn't get anything done. Let's try something else.
It's going to be interesting. John Funn, thank you much.
Thank you.
Read John in National Review. Go to nro.com.
Nationalreview.com.
Listen for me on KHOW Radio. Read me in the Post, and we'll see you next week.